A very good morning, my dear students. In this session on object-oriented concepts and programming with C++, I will be discussing about the basic concepts of object-oriented programming. This is a very important session in order to understand the remaining concepts in object-oriented programming. In the previous session, we discussed about the need for object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming has been evolved to eliminate the drawbacks of procedure-oriented programming. The two drawbacks of procedure-oriented programming are the data is not given importance because in the procedure-oriented programming, the focus is mainly on functions. Hence, data can easily move from one function to another function, and hence your data is not secured in POP. Another major drawback of procedure-oriented programming is arrangement of the data cannot be altered unless you modify the function which depends on that data. This is quite a tedious task or a challenging task. And object-oriented programming was developed to eliminate these two main drawbacks. In the previous session, I gave a brief introduction to the object-oriented programming and the philosophy that is behind object-oriented programming. The main objective of this session is to introduce the fundamental concepts of object-oriented programming, the concepts on which object-oriented programming has been designed, and to bring out the superiority or the advantages of object-oriented programming over procedure-oriented programming, and to bring out the striking characteristics of object-oriented programming. After attending this session, at the end of this session, you should be in a position to understand what are all the basic concepts of OOPS. How object-oriented programming is different from a procedure-oriented programming. And you should be in a position to understand why object-oriented programming is preferred over conventional procedure-oriented programming. In the previous session, I give you a brief introduction to object-oriented programming. Here I will discuss the different definition or what is the basic methodology in object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming is one method of implementation, just similar to your procedure-oriented programming. But in object-oriented programming, the program is organized as a collection of cooperative objects. While in a procedure-oriented programming, the program is organized as a cooperative collection of functions. But here it is organized as a cooperative collection of objects. Every object represents an instance of some class. That means every object is a member of a particular class. For example, if you consider a class called BCA. So BCA is a class which is derived from the upper class called courses. So course is a general class from which we form a new class called BCA. From that one we can form another class called second sum, third sum BCA, etc. So the classes are all members of hierarchy of classes which are united via inheritance relationship. The concept of inheritance I'm going to explain in the subsequent slide. It is an approach. Object-oriented programming is an approach that provides a way of decomposing a program or a way of modularizing a program. In the case of procedure-oriented programming, the modularity is achieved by decomposing the program into functions. Whereas in a case of object-oriented programming, the decomposition is achieved by dividing the program into number of objects, by creating partition memory area for both data and function that can be used as a template. A collection of data and the function together, we call it a class. The meaning of class, the concept behind the class, everything I'm going to explain in the subsequent slide. And for creating copies of such modules on demand. So once you create a class, you can create copies of that one. These are the three basic philosophy behind object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming is based on 5 fundamental concepts. They are called as pillars of object-oriented programming. The first one is objects. Objects are the basic runtime entity. That means object, why they are called basic runtime entity means object takes place during execution. So every object takes some space, just like similar to your variables in a program. When you run the program, the memory allocated for variable, or the variable will take some space. Similarly, objects are also basic runtime entity in an object-oriented system. Every object is nothing but collection of two components. In the object-oriented programming, the program is nothing but collection of objects. Just similar to your procedure-oriented programming. In an object-oriented programming, the program is nothing but a collection of many objects. Any real-world item you assume or any real-world item you consider, that can be made as an object in an object-oriented programming. Anything you take, if you consider a teacher can be made as an object. If you consider bank, account can be made as an object. If you consider a pencil can be made as an object. So anything, any item that exists in the real world can be made as one object in OOPS. Every object takes space in the memory. So just like similar to your variable in an object-oriented programming, every object also takes some space. And every object has a unique number that's called as object ID. Then what do you mean by an object? Object is nothing but a component or a unit which consists of two parts. The first part contains set of data and the second part contains set of functions which operate on the data. So if you consider anything as an object, you should identify what are the data of that object and what are the functions of that particular object. So the data included within an object, we call it as member data, and the function exists within a particular object are called as member function. So data and function together are called as members of an object. The main difference between a procedure-oriented programming and object-oriented programming is, in the case of procedure-oriented programming, there is no one-to-one mapping of a real-world object with equivalent function. But in the case of object-oriented programming, every real-world object or every real-world item has one analogy with the equivalent object in the object-oriented programming. And every object belongs to a particular class. So when you say object, you should be in a position to identify it's nothing but a plastic cover which contains two parts. The first part contains certain data corresponding to the object. The second part contains certain function which can access the data. Next, collection of many objects of similar type, we call it a class. If you want to create object, first you have to identify to which class it belongs. So first you have to define the class. Once your class is defined, you can create any number of objects of that particular class. So class specify what data and what functions are included in the object that you are going to create out of that class. But one thing you should remember, that only object takes space in the memory, not the class. That's why object is considered as a runtime entity, not the class. So to understand the difference between objects and classes, now we'll consider certain examples. For example, if you consider the class called fruit, so mango, apple, cherry, all are different examples for fruit. In this case, fruit is considered as a class. Mango, apple, cherry are considered as object. So mango, apple, cherry all will have the characteristics of fruit. Similarly, pigeon, parrot, peacock are the objects which is derived from or which is belongs to a class called birds. Bus, lorry, car are the objects of the class called vehicle. Professor K.S. Manjunath, Lingana sir, Balkrishna, they are the objects of teacher class. Arun, Asha, Kiran are the objects of student class. BSc, BCA, MSc are the objects of course class. In your second semester, you have studied about stack, queue, linked list, etc. So their stacks, linked list, tree are objects of a class called data structure. And similarly, Bangalore, Mysore, Mumbai are the objects of city class. So in order to first create the object, first we have to identify to which class they belong. So creation of the object includes defining the class first. Only after defining the class, you can create object. In your procedure-oriented programming like C, how do you declare a variable? The general syntax of declaration of variable is first specify the data type, then the variable name 1, variable name 2, etc. Example, int a comma b. The declaration int a comma b create two memory location, one for a and one for b. Both a and b will have similar characteristics because they belong to the same data type called int. Similarly, if we declare the declaration float c comma d, they create another two location, one for c and one for d. Now what happens is, since both c and d belongs to the same type called float, c also takes 4 bytes of memory, d also takes 4 bytes of memory. C also can contain fractional part, d also can contain fractional part. So the characteristics of float is there both in c and d. Similarly, in the previous example, the characteristics of integer is there in both a and b. And the last declaration, chars x, indicates that one x is a variable of the type char. So when you look at the previous declaration, here the data type int, float, char, they specify just that the data type will not take any space. So the variables of that type takes the space. So here the data type is equivalent to class, whereas variables are equivalent to object. So in the, if you may have if you make one-to-one mapping between a procedure-oriented programming and an object-oriented programming, variable names in procedure-oriented programming is equivalent to object names in object-oriented programming. Similarly, data type in procedure-oriented programming is equivalent to class in object-oriented programming. So this is an analogy between a POP and OOPS. Another characteristics or another basic concept of object-oriented programming is encapsulation. As I told earlier, every class includes certain data and certain function, and they are put together in a single unit called class. The reason is, once you put certain data and the certain function together into a single unit class means the data cannot move out of that class. The data cannot move out of that object. So the data is protected inside a particular class. Here only the security for data is given in the case of object-oriented programming. So the wrapping or the protection of data and the function together in a single unit, we call it as encapsulation. The main advantage of encapsulation concept is to provide security for your data, so that data cannot move out of one object to another object. So the member data of the particular object can be accessed only by the member function. Another member function cannot access the member data of this class or this object. Data cannot be accidentally modified by a non-members of a class. So only the member function which are present inside a particular class can access the member data of that particular class, not the member data of any other class. Inheritance. Assume that you have a situation like this. You have a class. From that class, I want to create or I want to construct another class, where the new class should contain all the characteristics of the original class. So such a process of creating a new class from an existing class, we call it as inheritance. The existing class, we call it as a base class. The new class you create out of the existing class, we call it as a derived class. All the characteristics, that means all the data and all the member functions of the base class is available for the derived class. But the derived class can have its own additional member data and can have its own additional member function. But the reverse is not true. The member data and the member functions of the derived class may not be present in the base class, but the member data and the member functions of the base class is available for the derived class. So the main advantage of inheritance is what is already there, we can reuse it. Suppose if there is a class called A, from that one I will derive a new class called B. Then what is already there in A need not be repeated in B. What is extra in B, you can add it to B. So your time is saved in programming. So that approach we call it as reusability. What is already available, don't repeat it again. You can just use it. See, as an example, consider a class called course. What are the basic details of the course? Instructor name, and the duration of the course. If it is a second, for example, if it's a third semester BCA, so the duration is BCA course is 3 years duration, and the instructor name could be anybody, Manjunath sir, Lingana sir, Balkrishna sir, anybody. From the course, I can derive two more course called, or two more class called UG course and PG course. EG course also have a instructor name. UG course also have duration. For example, the duration of the UG course will be 3 years. So instructor name and the duration is available for UG course. But UG course will have an additional feature called combination. So altogether, the characteristics of UG course are instructor name, duration of the course, and the combination. But the first two is already available in the original class. So the original here, the course is considered as a base class. UG course and the PG course are considered as the derived class. Similarly, in the derived class called PG, we can have an additional feature or additional characteristics called subject, whether it's in MSc Physics, MSc Mathematics, MSc Chemistry, etc. So altogether, the features of PG course are instructor name, duration of the course, and the subject. But the first two is already there in the base class, so I will add only the addition called subject. So now what happens is, from the main class called course, I have formed two subcourses, two different courses. One is called UG course and the one is called PG course. All the details of the main class or the base class course is available both for UG course and the PG course. But UG course has one additional data called combination, and PG has one additional data called subject. But combination and the subject, these are the additional features of the derived class, is not available for the base class called course. Polymorphism. In an object-oriented programming, in many situations, same operator can be used for two different purposes. Similarly, same function can be used for two different purposes. So, operator can take multiple form, function can take multiple form. For example, so poly means many, morphism means appearance. So, same operator is appeared in two different ways or two different forms. Same function in an object-oriented programming can appear in two different forms. That means same function name remains the same program that can be used for two different purposes. Similarly, same operator also in the same program can be used for two different purposes. I will give an example later. So, such an ability of the function or an operator to take more than one form is called operator overloading. It is called as polymorphism. So, polymorphism, there are two types. If the function takes more than one form, it is called as function polymorphism or function overloading. If the operator takes more than one form, it's called as operator overloading or operator polymorphism. In order to understand the concept of polymorphism, we can take one simple example. You consider any of the film actor, Dr. Rajkumar. In one movie, he acts as a lawyer. In one movie, he acts as a singer. In one movie, he acts as a professor. So here what happens is, the person remains the same. The person here is Dr. Rajkumar. The appearance, the morphology is different. In one movie, his role is lawyer. In one movie, his role is something else. In one movie, his appearance or his role will be something different. Same person, take three different forms. So that is an example for polymorphism. Consider the operator plus. In C language, where do you use plus operator? Plus operator generally is used to add two integer number or to add two float number or two real number. But in C++, if you give two integers as an input for the plus operator, it gives you the sum. For example, if the first number is 10, second number is 25. If you apply the plus operator between 10 and 25, you will get the sum as 35. So in the first case, in this example, here the plus operator is to add two numbers. The second example, for the same operator plus, if you give the two strings as an input, that gives you another string as an output. So here the plus operator is used for concatenation purpose. Here the plus operator is used for addition purpose. So in both the cases, the operator is plus only, but its behavior is entirely different. In the first example, it gives a sum of two numbers. The second example, it gives a concatenation of two strings. So depending on the operand you are specifying for that operator, if you specify two integers as operand, it gives you the same. Instead of two integers as operand, if you give two strings as operand, it gives you the concatenated string as an output. So in both the example here, we say that one, the plus operator is overloaded. Same operator plus I've used for two different purposes. In the first case, I've used a plus operator to find the sum of two integers. The second example, the same plus operator I have used to concatenate the two strings. Message passing. How two functions communicate with each other in case of procedure-oriented programming? In a POP or procedure-oriented programming, communication between two functions takes place through passing of arguments. But in the case of object-oriented programming, two objects can communicate with each other. So the message communication is another concept which allows different objects to communicate with each other. Suppose you consider two objects called object A and object B. Object A has some data and some function. Object B has some data and some function. Now, if object A wants to communicate with object B, direct communication is not allowed. The member function of the object A has to pass a request to the member function of object B. Now, the member function of the object B access its member data and pass that member data to the member function of the object A. So, direct passing of the data from one object to another object is not permitted. In that case, there is no difference between a procedure-oriented programming and object-oriented programming. So, direct transfer is not possible. The communication between two objects takes place via the member functions of the respective classes. So, while passing the message, we have to specify the name of the object, name of the member function, and what information you have to pass it. So, a message for an object, suppose object A wants to communicate with object B. So, in that case, object A has to pass a message to object B. It's nothing but a request for the execution of the corresponding member function. I told you, if the object A wants to communicate with object B, direct communication is not possible. Only the member function of object A has to communicate with the member function of object B. So, object communication means in turn is nothing but communication among the two member functions of the two objects. Whenever you want to do programming in an object-oriented programming, you have to follow three basic steps. First, you have to create a class. What creating a class means specify what data should be included in that class and what are all the different functions which can operate or which can access the data. So first identify the class name, then identify the data to be included in that class, then identify the functions to be included in that class. Once the class is created, you can create objects. So objects are nothing but members of class. We have to consider the example of teacher and some teacher named like ASM, NL, etc. So in order to create the two objects ASM and NL, first you have to define what is the class name. Here the class name is teacher. First specify the data for that class. What are the data of the teacher? Teacher name, qualification, experience, date of birth, etc. What are the function? One function I can write it to calculate their experience, and one function I can write it to know their retirement date, etc. Next, if you declare two variables KSM and NL, so KSM also has all the member data of teacher class. KSM also will have all the member function of the teacher class. Finally, establishing communication among objects. In the previous slide, I explained how two objects can communicate with each other. Objects can communicate with each other by invoking the member functions of the respective classes or the corresponding classes. So based on the discussion we had today, these are the probable review questions. Some of these questions are very, very important because your entire object-oriented programming discussion is based on today's session. Mention the basic concepts of you. If the question is just a mention of basic concept, you can give object, classes, inheritance, polymorphism, message passing, etc. Explain briefly the concepts of OOP. Here, every concept you explain with some simple example. With an example, explain the concept of objects and class. Objects are nothing but runtime entity. Bear in mind, objects are the runtime entity. Classes are not the runtime entity. In order to create object, first you have to create the class. Right? Short note on polymorphism, message passing, inheritance. To test your understanding level on the today's session, I have framed some 5 multiple choice question. OOPS is based on dash approach. A procedure-oriented programming is based on top-down approach, because there what happens, first you have the problem called P, that is decomposed into sub-problems called P1, P2. If P1 is big, you divide further into P11, P12, etc. So there a POP follow top-down approach. In the case of object-oriented program, first you have to identify the object, which is object A, which is object B. If you want, you can join these two objects to form a bigger object. You form a bigger object, etc. So it follows the property of bottom-up approach. Object is an instance or is an example of function, class, operator, program. We know that every object is an instance of a particular class. For example, linked list is an instance of data structure class. Pigeon is an instance of bird class. Lorry is an instance of vehicle class. Wrapping of data and function into a single unit called object is called the process of putting some data and some function together with a label either as a class or object. We call the concept as encapsulation. Encapsulation main advantage is it provides more security for your data. Data cannot move out of that object. You are tying, you are binding the object, you are binding the data and the function together in a single unit. That bondage is created. Data type in procedure-oriented programming is equivalent to dash in object-oriented programming. So variable is equivalent to object. Data type is equivalent to class. The last question. In an object-oriented programming, reusability is achieved through which concept? Encapsulation. Encapsulation concept is for protecting data from moving out of the particular object. Polymorphism means providing more strength either for an object or a operator. Operator also can take multiple form. Function also can take multiple form. Message passing is to establish the communication between two objects. Inheritance means you have a class, from that one, if you want to create a new class, then you can use the concept of inheritance. So inheritance, what happens? What is already there, since you are not repeating again and again, it gives you reusability. You can see the correct answer as. So thank you. Thanks for your patience listening. Again, if you have any queries, you can contact me. Thank you.